The hospital room was dim, the only light spilling from a small lamp on the nightstand, casting a soft golden glow across the sterile white walls. Margaret, a 62-year-old nurse with silver-streaked hair and tired eyes, sat in a creaky chair, cradling a tiny baby wrapped in a blue blanket. The infant, barely a week old, whimpered softly, his tiny fists curling against her chest. His mother, Sarah, lay in the bed nearby, her face pale, her breathing shallow, hooked to machines that beeped in a relentless rhythm. Margaret's arms ached, but she didn't move. She hadn't moved for hours. The baby, unnamed, alone except for her, needed the warmth of her touch. Outside, a Minnesota snowstorm howled, blanketing the small-town hospital in white. Margaret whispered to the baby, her voice a gentle hum. "You're not alone, little one. I've got you." Her heart twisted as she glanced at Sarah, who hadn't opened her eyes in days. What does it feel like to hold on to hope when the world feels so cold? Margaret wondered, her own breath catching. She'd been a nurse for 30 years, seen countless lives begin and end, but this tiny life in her arms, this mother fighting to stay, felt heavier than anything she'd carried before. Sarah had come into the ER 10 days ago, a single mother with no family, collapsing from a rare infection that had spiraled out of control. The baby, delivered by emergency C-section, was healthy but fragile, needing constant care. The hospital was short-staffed, the nursery overwhelmed, and Margaret, nearing retirement, had volunteered to stay with him. Day after day, she clocked out but didn't leave. She held him, fed him, sang to him, her voice cracking over old lullabies her own children, now grown, once loved. Her knees ached, her back screamed, but she couldn't put him down. I had no one else. The other nurses whispered about her dedication, but to Margaret, it wasn't dedication, it was necessity. A child shouldn't be alone. Not like this. The snow kept falling, and the hospital felt like a world unto itself, quiet except for the hum of machines and the baby's soft coos. Margaret's husband, Tom, called every evening, his voice warm but worried through the phone. "You're gonna wear yourself out, Maggie," he'd say, and she'd smile, promising to rest soon. But she didn't. Not yet. The baby's warmth against her chest was a tether, keeping her grounded, keeping her here. She thought of her own son, lost to a car accident at 19, and the ache of that loss bloomed anew. What does it mean to hold someone when you know what it's like to let go? She brushed a tear from her cheek, careful not to wake the baby. The days blurred, each one a marathon of feeding, rocking, and whispering to the tiny boy who didn't yet have a name. She called him Little Star in her mind, after the lullaby she sang when the room grew too quiet. Sarah's condition didn't improve, and the doctors' faces grew graver. Margaret overheard their hushed conversations, words like sepsis and critical, and her heart sank deeper. She looked at the baby, his tiny chest rising and falling, and wondered what would become of him if Sarah didn't wake up. Who would love him? Who would hold him through the long nights? The thought was a knife, sharp and cold, and she pushed it away, focusing on the weight in her arms, the soft scent of baby powder and milk. Then, on the 7th day, something shifted. A young man, maybe 30, with a worn denim jacket and a shy smile, appeared at the door of Sarah's room. His name was Daniel, a barista from the coffee shop down the street, the one Sarah visited every morning before she got sick. He'd heard about her from a regular customer, a nurse who mentioned the young mother fighting for her life. Daniel stood awkwardly, clutching a paper bag with a blueberry muffin, Sarah's favorite, he said. She always ordered one, said it made her day, he mumbled, his cheeks flushing. Margaret looked up, surprised, her arm still cradling the baby. "You knew her?" she asked, her voice soft but curious. Daniel nodded, his eyes fixed on Sarah's still form. "Not well, but she was kind, always tipped, even when she looked like she couldn't afford it. She'd talk about her baby, how excited she was." He paused, his voice breaking. "I just wanted to do something." Margaret felt a warmth spread through her chest, a flicker of hope. What does a small gesture mean when it comes from the heart? She gestured for him to sit, and he did hesitantly, placing the muffin on the nightstand. The baby stirred, and Daniel's eyes widened. "Is that her son?" he asked, his voice barely a whisper. Margaret nodded, offering a tired smile. "Wanna hold him?" Daniel froze, then shook his head, nervous. "I don't know how. I'd mess it up." But Margaret's gentle insistence won him over, and she carefully passed the baby into his arms, guiding his hands. Daniel's face softened, his awkwardness melting as the baby nestled against him. "He's so small," he whispered, a tear slipping down his cheek. Margaret watched, her heart swelling. A stranger, moved by a memory, had stepped into this quiet, lonely room. It wasn't Mucha Muffin, a visit, but it felt like the world. Over the next few days, Daniel returned. He brought coffee for Margaret, decaf because she'd mentioned her heart couldn't handle the real stuff anymore. He brought stories too, shyly sharing how Sarah's smile had brightened his mornings, how she'd once helped him clean up a spilled latte even though she was 8 months pregnant. Margaret listened, her hands resting for the first time in days as Daniel held the baby. They talked about small things, Thanksgiving dinners with too much pie, the way snow made the town feel like a postcard, the old jukebox at the diner that still played Elvis. Daniel's visits became a rhythm, a quiet bond forming between him and Margaret, stitched together by their care for the baby and Sarah. One evening, as the snow fell softer outside, Daniel looked at Margaret and asked, "Do you think she knows we're here?" Margaret's throat tightened, her eyes drifting to Sarah. "I think she feels it," she said, her voice trembling. Love has a way of getting through. What does it mean to care for someone who might never know? Daniel nodded, his gaze soft, and reached for Margaret's hand, giving it a gentle squeeze. How does a shared hope weave strangers into family? Their hands lingered, a silent promise to keep showing up, to keep holding on. The baby cooed, and they both smiled, the room feeling a little less heavy. On the 10th day, everything changed. Margaret was rocking the baby, her voice hoarse from singing, when Sarah's fingers twitched. Margaret froze, her heart pounding. She called for the doctor, her voice shaking, and within minutes, the room was a flurry of nurses and monitors. Sarah's eyes fluttered open, weak but alive, her gaze finding her baby in Margaret's arms. "My boy," she whispered, tears spilling down her pale cheeks. Margaret's own tears fell as she placed the baby in Sarah's arms, her hands trembling. The room felt electric, alive with a miracle no one had dared hope for. Daniel, who'd arrived with his usual coffee and muffin, stood in the doorway, his eyes wide, his breath catching. "She's awake," he whispered, almost to himself. Margaret nodded, her heart too full for words. The doctor confirmed Sarah was stabilizing, her infection finally responding to treatment. Margaret and Daniel stepped back, giving Sarah space to hold her son, to whisper his name Elijah for the first time. The moment was a quiet thunder, a turning point that reshaped the air. Margaret felt the weight of 10 days lift, replaced by a warmth that spread from her chest to her fingertips. Kindnessers, Daniels, even the nurses who'd whispered encouragement had carried them here. It wasn't grand gestures, but small, steady ones. A held baby, a brought muffin, a shared story. The power of those acts wove them together, a tapestry of hope that held strong when everything else felt fragile. Sarah's recovery was slow, but each day brought new light. Margaret visited no longer as a nurse, but as a friend, bringing homemade apple pie from her own kitchen. Daniel kept coming too, his shy smiles growing bolder as he played with Elijah, tickling his tiny feet. Sarah, still weak, would watch them, her eyes shining with gratitude. One afternoon, in the hospital's small garden, dusted with fresh snow, Sarah took Margaret's hand. "You held him when I couldn't," she said, her voice breaking. "You gave him a home in your arms." Margaret's eyes welled up and she shook her head. "It wasn't just me," she said, glancing at Daniel, who was bouncing Elijah gently. "It was all of us." They sat together, the three of them, under a bare oak tree, the baby giggling as snowflakes dusted his blanket. The town felt alive around them, the distant hum of a church choir practicing for Christmas, the scent of diner coffee lingering in the air. Margaret thought of her own losses, her own joys, and how this moment, this unlikely family, felt like a gift she hadn't expected, hope she realized wasn't a loud thing. It was quiet, persistent, built from hands that held, hearts that showed up. As the sun dipped low, painting the snow gold, she felt a peace she hadn't known in years. What's the kindest thing you've experienced? Share in the comments. It might inspire our next video. Has a small act of kindness ever changed your day or your life? Share your story in the comments below. It might inspire our next video. Subscribe to The Kind Story for weekly heartwarming stories. Hit the bell and check out our playlist of emotional videos. Disclaimer: this story is a fictional or dramatized narrative created for emotional inspiration and entertainment. While it reflects real human emotions, all characters, names, and events are fictional or modified for storytelling purposes.